I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we got another great show for you today. We are thrilled to welcome back, obviously, our co-host, Ben, who was dearly missed on the last episode, although our friend Will Chamberlain did an admirable job subbing in at the last minute. So today we got a characteristically jam-packed schedule. Emily's going to tee us off by talking about how Facebook is courting religious communities. I will then talk about the hysterical media meltdown, for lack of a better term, over Tucker Carlson having the audacity to visit Budapest, Hungary last week. Rachel's going to talk about President Biden's his budget remaking America. Very, very dire stuff there. And then Ben will close out talking about how big business is going all in for China, kind of an evergreen topic there. But Emily, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to start off by talking about a report in the Daily Caller News Foundation by Mary Margaret Olohan, who covers faith issues for them really well. This is a report based on an interview and a story that the New York Times did about Facebook's concerted effort to become a platform for religious experiences, or to become even more of a platform for religious experiences. This is particularly interesting in the context of what we discussed just last week about Mark Zuckerberg's intention to say Facebook within the next 5 years will no longer be seen as a social media company, but a metaverse company. The metaverse is virtual reality, as we've discussed. It's where Zuckerberg is intent on shifting our lives, making it easier for us to do everything, essentially everything, virtually. He actually listed off church in that interview. So this is now Facebook saying it will become more and more of a space for people to have religious gatherings. This should be terrifying, particularly to Christians, because we've seen the way that Facebook treats things like the pro-life movement in and of itself. I mean, you have that right away, the way that Facebook has treated content. Now, it's true that some of the top pages on Facebook are conservative. That's absolutely true. A lot of, for instance, Daily Wire content, Ben Shapiro content does exceptionally well on Facebook. So Facebook is at least helpful to disseminating those messages for now. But the fact that you have a group of Silicon Valley oligarchs who are literally trying to take our lives into a virtual space, are working on those algorithms and are working on that technology every single day, and then are also saying they are going to be working hard to make religion a bigger part of that experience. I just want to open up the floor because it's obviously kind of abstract right now. We're talking about plans, we're talking about hypotheticals, but Facebook has a very real track record when it comes to censorship. Facebook has a very real track record when it comes to not understanding a wide swath of the country. Facebook has a very real track record when it comes to abusing its power willfully and even unwittingly, not even realizing the power that it has at its disposal. So I'll just open up the floor. What do you guys think about Facebook's intentions here?
I just think there couldn't be more misunderstanding on every single side of this conversation. I don't think Facebook at all understands what religious people believe, because traditional religious views, Facebook categorizes as, misinformation or hate speech. Traditional views about marriage, pro-life, go down the line. I don't think Facebook really understands what religious people think and believe. But the second thing is, any church that's considering, entangling itself with Facebook for its outreach, for its evangelism, for its, reaching people even virtually for worship service has been done during COVID, clearly does not understand the stakes of how Facebook views this debate. Like, you cannot put your evangelistic mission through a company who hates you. That is completely at odds with what evangelism is supposed to be. So I just think there is every possible scenario here is not going to work out well for the religious community. But I also think that, as you point out, Emily, this should be facially obvious to people who've been paying attention. Facebook, and I actually talked to Mary Margaret for this piece, and I made the point, like, Facebook doesn't support or engage in respecting our traditional First Amendment values. Why on earth would it respect religious liberty? Why on earth is that something we'd expect them to do? But again, this goes back to Facebook's plan to sort of subsume and entangle itself into every possible area of our lives. And I think, again, when it comes to religious practice, I also think that that's at odds with what that's supposed to be. Yes, you want community. Yes, you want to build your community and engage with it, but you cannot do it through, a hostile intermediary, which I'm sorry, it is what Facebook is. So I just would say, as a warning to any religious institution that thinks that Facebook is going to deal with them fairly, they have no track record of doing so, and it would be a mistake to assume otherwise.
So, I mean, I hate to go like ad hominem here, but to go ad hominem a little, just maybe just a little bit. So I'm recording this from my childhood home for the viewers. It's my parents' house. They still live here in suburban New York. Mark Zuckerberg had his bar mitzvah at the synagogue, like literally like a mile and a half from here. It was at a Reform synagogue. He is, if I'm not mistaken, is now like avowedly atheist. Mark Zuckerberg has like, I think, like gone out of his way to like kind of virtue signal to kind of like the new atheist crowd. Again, I hate to go like this level of ad hominem, but like he married a non-Jewish woman. I mean, like anyone who thinks that Mark Zuckerberg like personally has like any credibility on these issues is like completely and utterly mistaken. Now, look, I like Rachel probably because we're both kind of very heavy in the big tech issue. I have developed somewhat of a rapport from Facebook's kind of I won't name names here, but like their guy on payroll who's like a former Republican congressman who's like his job is kind of like reach out to folks like this. He has a background in kind of religious liberty circles. Seems like a very nice guy. I've had very, very many nice conversations with him. But like as a corporate level entity, if you look at what Facebook does as far as the algorithms and what they do list over and over again as hate speech and kind of they effectively shadow ban. These are just simply not trustworthy people here, and I think it would be a drastic mistake to kind of go down that rabbit hole. Now, look, Emily mentioned Daily Wire, and I used to work at Daily Wire, right? And a lot of what Daily Wire does, and they are truly terrific at this, okay? But they're not getting like any favorable treatment because they are a conservative website. They're getting favorable treatment because they're incredibly good at working the systems and kind of and search, SEO, all that kind of stuff. This stuff is frankly way above my head. I had nothing to do with that when I was at Daily Wire. Obviously, I'm a content guy, but that team is just exceptionally good at that. So I would not take the Daily Wire thing to be more than it should be, I guess.
I think Rachel's description of essentially Facebook being a hostile intermediary is a very good paradigm through which to see it. If anything, maybe that's even a diplomatic description of what we're talking about here in terms of a big tech that is, of course, anathema in its thinking writ large to traditional believers, Jews, Christians, and beyond. So the notion that those communities ought to congregate in a platform that is obviously hostile to them is, of course, asinine on its face. And I think everyone would do well to remember that you are the product when it comes to Facebook. And so consequently, why would you trust this hostile intermediary, which of course is going to be able to collect information on you and of course target you with political and all manner of other messages as well while you're using this platform? Why would you ever think that would be a beneficial thing for engendering a sense of community? I also think, kind of a broader conversation, but one of the perverse ways that the pandemic has been exploited, of course, is pushing us all far deeper into this digital universe. And I think as one of the consequences, you could see potentially a breakup of traditional religious life in this country to some extent by dint of the fact that we've all been pushed into our homes and onto our devices rather than having in-person interactions, which of course has all manner of societal consequences as well, not interacting in person, not developing a real community in real time in person, and all the skills, of course, for younger Americans that go along with actually interacting face to face and live. So there are all manner of negative and perverse knock-on effects to this. I think it ought to be seen in broader context. But the bottom line, of course, is why would you trust essentially your worst adversary with helping to form the communities that are deepest to you on the most important issues to millions of Americans, namely their faith?
And I'll just jump in quickly before Josh goes to say this is a trap. They are trapping us into spending more and more time on their products, and then they are going to deprive us of our freedoms. They will be using their products to make money off of us while subjecting us, like literally treating us as subjects, where we won't be able to practice our religion freely because, wow, everybody has just freely chosen to congregate in this virtual metaverse space, and that's where your church is happening. Guess what? You can't say what you want to say about marriage. You can't say what you want to say about sex. you can't say what you want to say, and what is so fundamental to your faith about all of these, about life, about all of these various issues. It is a trap. They're trapping us into their space so that they can exert more control over us, make more money off of us, make us more compliant and more ideologically in lockstep with every single thing that they believe. This is about creating the uniform. Like this is the ideological uniform. And it's coming really quickly, to Zuckerberg's point about this happening within 5 years, metaverse wise. So combined, I think these two reports are troubling. But with that, I'll toss it over to Josh.
Yeah, so definitely troubling, obviously, on the Facebook front, but also troubling, I think, is the level of hysterical meltdown that we have seen from largely across the political spectrum, honestly, from certain quarters about Tucker Carlson, who of course has the highest rated show on cable news. He's become something of an avatar in conservative, it's definitely national conservative circles. For Tucker having the audacity to go film his show in Budapest, Hungary last week. So I have no idea how long this was in the making. I kind of only caught wind of it maybe like a day or two before he traveled over there. I think he technically traveled over. He was speaking at a festival kind of in the countryside, sponsored by MCC, which is a very popular kind of right of center kind of think tank consortium institution of sorts. I've gotten to know a lot of the MCC people as well in kind of my own personal capacity. They're genuinely just great people from all that I can tell. Dennis Prager was there as well, by the way. I haven't heard a whole lot of criticism of Dennis Prager. It's really all focused on Tucker. So Tucker basically, he filmed his show last week, all the nights, all 5 nights from Budapest. He had a one-on-one sit down with Viktor Orban, who of course is the leader of Hungary. Now, Hungary, we talked about in this show, it's a country that geopolitically, economically, militarily, diplomatically is probably not that interesting, frankly, in kind of like the grand geopolitical scheme of things. I think their national GDP is like substantially smaller than like New York State's or Texas's, for example, or anything like that. But they do punch above their weight class as far as kind of setting an example, I think, for a lot of kind of right of center types. Orban is kind of one of the only kind of prominent it might be really kind of with the possible exception of Prime Minister Morawiecki in Poland and maybe kind of a handful of others here and there. He's probably kind of the most outspoken kind of Western style conservative governing. I guess Bolsonaro in Brazil as well. So there are a handful of people here, but Hungary has really kind of taken the lead and kind of aggressively kind of defying a lot of kind of more liberal kind of Brussels-centric EU diktats pertaining to kind of LGBT and borders, immigration, Islamic immigration. Obviously, in Europe is a very kind of sensitive issue for a lot of folks for obvious reasons. But anyways, Tucker decided to go here, and the firestorm that it set off was really something to behold. Jay Norlinger, who's been in National Review forever, probably for 30, 40 years, did a short tweet thread about how kind of like the fight is on now between kind of the illiberal Orbanistas and the quote unquote principled Madisonian conservatives. I'm a constitutional law guy by background. I don't really know what a quote unquote Madisonian conservative is. Perhaps Gene Norlinger can inform me. But setting up this total false dichotomy, David French and Jonah Goldberg at the Dispatch, who query whether they're even worth talking about on this podcast, but they kind of tag teamed and did kind of their own kind of side-by-side takedown pieces or putative takedown pieces of the message that Tucker going to Budapest sends on the Dispatch site on the same day. We've seen this really all across the spectrum. I mean, here we're talking about kind of the center-right establishment. So hold aside, obviously, what people on the left are saying. Look, I make no apologies for the Orban government or Hungary. They have plenty of their own kind of issues. You kind of get in there. They are far closer to the Chinese Communist Party than I think Americans and American conservatives in particular should be comfortable with. There's a solid amount of venality and corruption at the government level, as there is, frankly, in a lot of these kind of former Iron Curtain countries that are still kind of working out the kinks, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But we talk about Hungary more than perhaps other shows do, because it is in many ways like an actual example of how to go about setting kind of a national conservative agenda that is adamant about securing borders, retaining cultures, and being unapologetically inspired by the Judeo-Christian tradition, and not having this sort of kind of moral, intellectual, or religious relativism that might inspire kind of a multiculturalist agenda, the likes of which the American left is certainly kind of latching onto. So anyway, Tucker going there really just set off this massive firestorm. I thought his interview with Orban was perfectly anodyne. I didn't find anything offensive in that whatsoever, personally. But it's just really telling. And I can't pinpoint exactly what it is about this necessarily that sets so many people off. But I think back, for example, and I'll just throw it open on this. I mean, I think back to like the Cold War era, for example, when you had so many like prominent Democrats, so many prominent leftists during like the 60s, 70s, 80s, who were fairly openly siding with the Soviet Union, right? I mean, think about like Bernie Sanders honeymooning in the Soviet Union. Ted Kennedy did not exactly have a great track record all across the years either of talking about the Soviet Union back in the heyday of the Cold War. So on the one hand, like Democrats were openly siding with a geopolitical arch enemy who wanted to nuke us into existence at a time of the Cold War. And on the other hand, now Tucker can't go to a very small and not particularly geopolitically consequential country that might have some good conservative ideas. I mean, like the whole thing is just nuts. But I mean, Rachel, I mean, maybe you want to kick us off because you obviously had a tweet that went particularly viral. So maybe you want to tell us about how Matt Iglesias sicked his blue check mob on you.
Yeah, perhaps it's quaint to say this, but so much of our conversation about Hungary on this show, I think, and on the right writ large, has been fairly nuanced. And then, because there's things to criticize about Hungary and there's things that are interesting, and then suddenly it has become so binary and so entrenched that you're like anti or pro, and there is nothing in between. And this is sort of where I found myself. I think, when we've talked about Hungary on the show before, I've been slightly critical of the idea that like what works there can work here. I think it's interesting to study, but I'm very critical of like trying to import, different government styles from different countries. But what I did do over the weekend was I read a long essay by Rod Dreher on this topic. And Rod Dreher, the American conservative, is someone who spent time in Hungary, traveled a lot in Eastern Europe. I think had a fairly balanced view on, what Orban did well, things that obviously wouldn't work here. And I shared a quote from it that I thought was a fairly sort of anodyne statement. And like Matt Iglesias turned his bot army on me for 12 straight hours.
And you deserved it.
Like,
you deserved every single one of those tweets.
For like, for being like every single possible crime for doing this. And I just think it's like amazing to watch the meltdown that's happening. And I also wanted to share this to kind of like the unself-awareness, I think, of some of the people in this debate. There's a tweet by Ann Applebaum that I want to share here, and I'll just read it. In Orban's Hungary, 90+% of the media is controlled by the ruling party. Businesses are physically and legally harassed if they don't toe the party line or if someone wants to buy them cheap. Elections are manipulated. Party leaders are mysteriously rich. Is this a model for Fox? And I just wanted to be like, who are you this unself-aware? Like that this is your critique of Hungary? Like, it's like, lady, wake up to the country you're living in and what time it is here in the United States. So, I think there always is, much to learn from the way other countries are doing things. The way I think Josh characterizes is correct. Like he's taken a specific approach many times that we've talked about, pulling different elements, possibly for governance here. There's a lot of things that are wrong here. Also, I'm concerned about the ties of the government to China. I'm concerned about all these things, but you can have two views at once, right? And you don't have to like affirmatively declare people fascists, which is essentially what happened to me this weekend. So just the dialogue is just completely, it's a dumpster fire.
Well, I actually thought this spawned a lot of interesting discussion, and I completely blame Rachel for tweeting that Rod Dreher article out. And I was just like Saturday was gone after I read that article. It took me like an hour to get through that article. And then I was in a million different rabbit holes from the hyperlinks in the article, just like learning about Hungary and reading like old David Frum pieces. It was just really a Saturday well spent. So thank you, Rachel. But it opened up this really interesting discussion about what's good in America. And I think that was at the heart of what Matthew Iglesias and Josh Barrow were fighting about with others, like with Rachel and other conservatives and with the Rod Drehers of the world. Rod Dreher had a really poignant point in that essay where he was going back and forth with people who say, listen, like they don't have dryers in a lot of Europe. Like, aren't you happy to have dryers? And like, as a woman, yes, absolutely. It saves me a lot of time. I love having dryers and washing machines and dishwashers and all of those things. But if that is your definition of happiness, you are you have this sort of like you are under the tyranny of this vapid materialism that has overtaken America's way of thinking. And Orban, for all of those nuances and all those faults and failures, is a reaction to the consequences of the vapid materialism of the contemporary West. And he's taking steps to address that. Those steps are absolutely problematic, I think, in many respects, but that's what Tucker is interested in. And so it's like YouTube with ivermectin, like not letting Brett Weinstein talk about it. This is emblematic of we can't even have these conversations anymore. Shut down. How dare you query somebody? How dare you even speak to them, engage with them? They are beyond the pale. And to do so, you are identifying yourself as a conspiracy theorist and an authoritarian and a bigot. And this dust up, which I think probably only penetrated, the sort of intellectual circles of the Twitter sphere. It is, though, very symbolic of so much that is wrong.
I was struck by the Applebaum tweet as well, because I think it just perfectly captures the projection of our ruling class. I think we've covered sort of the nuance of what are the merits and demerits of Hungary as a symbol of national conservatism. And I think that in part answers, by the way, the question of why. Why was there this massive, virulent backlash to Tucker having the gall to go over there and speak to Orban? Because Hungary is, in some respects, a living rejection, essentially a middle finger to the ruling class's liberal, progressive internationalism, or however we want to define it, because it is a country that cares about preserving and protecting actual Western traditions, our Judeo-Christian heritage, values, principles, sovereignty, a culture, etc. And that, of course, just flies in the face of everything our citizens of the world and the ruling class believe in, or at least act as if they believe in, because it serves their self-interested ends. I would say just a couple more brief observations. The first one was, it just struck me that Orban, even not speaking in his native tongue in English, would have run circles in a debate around Joe Biden. And I would actually love to see that kind of debate take place, although, of course, it never will, because as the interview covered, Biden's called him a thug or an authoritarian, etc. I also was struck by the comment by Orban where Tucker asked, well, are you concerned about foreign election interference? And he says, concerned, of course there's going to be foreign election interference, and we're prepared to essentially crush it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing there, but it was just so entertaining to see the contrast there. I would also recommend Chris Caldwell had a great profile, long form profile in the Claremont Review of Books on Orban. We can look to the merits and demerits, but I think the important thing is it's ironic that the only powers really who are standing up for Judeo-Christian Western civilization are the ones who are under the thumb of communism and got out from under it. And I think one of the downsides to America having not faced such tyranny, I mean, perversely, is that we have not mustered the courage to stand up for those principles again, because we haven't been challenged to date. We are being challenged today, and more people, thankfully, are waking up to it, but still too few, I would argue.
Yeah, so let me just very quickly wrap a bow on this and then kick it over to Rachel for our third segment here. But there's this talking point that Orban himself is a fascist, right? That's the word that gets thrown around a lot here. Now, look, the Hungarian government that was occupied during World War II did not exactly cover itself in glory, but the current Hungarian government is extremely far from fascistic. Now, obviously, I've mentioned a little bit how they're standing up to kind of the aggressively pro-LGBT agenda from Brussels. So, his kind of pro-Christian bona fides are certainly unquestioned. But even just talking about the Jewish population in Hungary is thriving. The major synagogue in Budapest is beautiful. It's actually stunning to look at. Jews there walk along the streets with kippahs, being publicly Jewish in a way they could never do in Paris or Brussels. Super quick. Last month I was at CPAC. I gave a keynote address during the kind of CPAC Shabbat lunch, like a little impromptu address. And at some point, Orban came up in my remarks, and a public, someone who we would know, like an Orthodox Jew, I won't name names, it's a private conversation, but a kippah-clad Orthodox Jew got up and said, Viktor Orban is the thought leader of Western civilization. So just thrown out there, the man is not exactly a fascist. But anyway, let's move on. Rachel, what's going on Capitol Hill with the budget?
Yeah, so of course, the right-wing intellectual chattering class is obsessed with Hungary. Well, this not obsessed with what's happening on Capitol Hill, which we actually rarely talk about on this show, which I think is less indicative of our interest than it is about the fact that nothing ever happens there. But something is actually happening right now. This morning, the Senate passed its $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure legislation with 69 votes, and is in the process of immediately pivoting to considering the Bernie Sanders budget resolution. And why I want to talk about this is because it is massive. It is a $3.5 trillion document that seeks to fundamentally remake the economy and reshape profoundly how the individual interacts with the government. And I think it's important to say here, budget resolutions never become law, right? They're not binding. They're only binding on the Congress. They're sort of the blueprint document under which appropriations legislation, spending legislation is put forward, and under which a reconciliation process will go forward in the fall. So this is the first step toward considering that much bigger package in the fall. But it's very instructive because it gives you an idea of what Democrats are going to try to do in that reconciliation and what they are going to try and do in their spending legislation. So I just wanted to pull up a couple of highlights that are in this bill, and it's, again, pretty large, so I'm only going to hit the highlights. There is a massive amnesty for illegal immigrants. It rewrites Medicaid statutes to bypass the Hyde prohibition. So the Hyde Amendment is the prohibition on federal funding for abortion. Yeah, that's gone. Paid family and medical leave, tuition-free community college, Medicare expansion. So we're covering a whole host of new things under Medicare now. Language similar to the PRO Act, which makes it a lot easier to unionize, and empowered IRS. By the way, we're paying for this by increasing taxes on corporations and those making over $400,000 a year. All kinds of goodies, not even mentioning the massive climate agenda that's in this bill as well. So again, this will never be binding on the country, but it is now the blueprint under which the spending legislation will start to be authored. So I kind of want to just throw it out there because, one, this is an incredibly aggressive agenda in and of itself, which I think presents concerns. But two, what's always remarkable to me about observing these Democrats for the last 2 years, and especially now, is the absolute moxie that they have to just try and use these levers to reshape everything in their image. You would never see a Republican majority do this. Like, to give you an idea of what we used reconciliation for, we couldn't even use it to repeal Obamacare. We couldn't even get the votes on our own side to repeal Obamacare. And when we had reconciliation, we passed Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Good things and bad things, but definitely not like the reach, right? This is a Bernie Sanders reach, a big bite. You wouldn't find a Republican majority on the face of the earth that would have the guts and the spine to do what Sanders is doing. So I kind of throw it open because the last thing I'll say is, by the way, the McConnell majority had one more bite at reconciliation when Trump was still in the White House and we still had the 3 houses of Congress. They didn't use it. That's how gutless Republicans are. They left a silver bullet on the table. So I'll throw it open for observations on the Sanders budget resolution, as well as, kind of where Republicans find themselves if they ever have this kind of opportunity.
This is why we lose, right? I mean, this is a recurring theme on this show, unfortunately. But Democrats win. I mean, the long march to progress. So the Gramsci-style long march through the institutions wins over the course of a century and a half or so, because when the left has power, it knows what to do with it. Now, part of this, of course, is that part of this is attitudinal. I think the problem on the right, part of it is actually substantive. So the attitudinal part, of course, is kind of like this David Frenchy kind of virtue signaling, like go along to get along. Republicans who understand that kind of cultural currents have been arrayed against them for the better part of a century are kind of, I think, diffident and timid and kind of like unwilling to actually try to exercise power when they have it for reasons of wanting to get their kids into the Ivy League, and they're not being kind of kicked off from their yacht clubs or boat clubs or whatever, stuff like that. But part of it is substantive, because I think for a long time, we're talking here about like budgets, kind of bread and butter fiscal policy here. I think for a long time, right? And you still see this in a lot of circles here. I think for the kind of conservative, libertarian, just generally right of center kind of economic mantra was that the kind of quintessence of economic statecraft was just to gut and slash and get the government out of everything. look, I mean, obviously we're talking in the midst of kind of what looks like the beginnings of a realignment. I think the American right is reconsidering a lot of kind of what it has previously thought of for the past 3 or 4 decades as kind of economic orthodoxy. And obviously we don't support, multi-trillion-dollar deficits or anything like that. But at the same time here, there is a role surely to be had for economic statecraft. And that doesn't mean you kind of get in there and try to kind of at a granular level, set prices or anything like that, or central planning. I mean, we've all read our Hayek, and none of us trying to kind of disown kind of Econ 101, but there surely is a role for economic policy making to kind of set up certain guardrails and channel market forces towards kind of those traditional conservative ends that we talk about, justice, the common good, human flourishing, and so forth. So there's been a lot of kind of revival of that sort of thought on the right. But I think the lack of that previously was the substantive problem. But look, I don't really know what else to say. I mean, like, the left knows what to do when it is in power. The question, if the country is going to be salvaged over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, is whether the right will ultimately learn what it can do and ultimately must do when it actually has power.
Well, I'll say I think a huge part of that is the media, and the reason people like Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, the far left often complains about the media being unfavorable to them. I should say, like, leftists, so genuine sort of economic progressives, believe that the media is stacked against them. And that is true when they're juxtaposed with people like Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's going to get more favorable coverage in a primary between Hillary and Bernie. But the media is going to give Bernie Sanders, and a bill like this, which has a lot of things the ideologues in the press and in corporate America are now in support of, they're going to cover that pretty favorably, actually, because the little millennial bloggers are like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool. Civilian Climate Corps, A+. And what is pretty concerning, there's actually a lot going on in this bill, obviously, but one of the things that's pretty concerning from my perspective is that they're just trying to make permanent this huge restructuring. And Rachel said this in her email for Bright this morning. It fundamentally reshapes the relationship between the government and the people that are governed by the government. If you are a family and you are now expecting hundreds of dollars in the mail every single month from the feds, that completely changes the way you raise your children. It completely changes the way you look to government versus yourself. That'll be great for a lot of families. It'll be terrible for a lot of families as well. That money will not go to children. This is a redistribution of money that a lot of people are busting their butts to make, and is then going in this, like, so there's something really interesting about the way, so I reported at the Federalist just this morning that they are, like, Republicans, according to a senior aide, are reluctant to criticize the child allowance extension in the bill. But I think Republicans are broadly, like, kind of reluctant to wade into this debate period, because Republicans don't want to talk about spending and entitlements and all of those things as sort of like relics of the Tea Party era. And a lot of that's for good reason. We do need to reshape our government to serve us better and to serve families better. And we need to shift our priorities. That, however, does not mean that creating poverty traps and cycles of dependency is a good thing either. And so on the one hand, I think, Republicans do need to use their power. Democrats have a huge advantage, and they now have every institution stacked in their favor. And so that explains a lot of their brashness at putting this $3.5 trillion bill on the table with a civilian climate corps or resolution on the table. So I think that explains it. But I also think Republicans now have a really hard time when they said that Obamacare was socialism, which to some extent, yes, it was. You can have that semantic debate, engaging in this conversation now, because it's, how do you talk about massive government spending when you also spend massively, and when you're also trying to use the levers of government to, shape priorities? It's just a difficult conversation right now.
Yeah, so I'll go back to my broken record argument, which is that everything about this particular legislative push demonstrates once again that among a substantial number of Republicans, clearly are purported elected representatives, they do not understand the stakes at all, or they're too cowardly to put up a fight given the understanding of the stakes, and essentially they're content to play controlled opposition and essentially be schooled by the Harlem Globetrotters, who aren't even all that competent in reality. If you were actually to fight them with the same gusto that the left fights. And I think, when you look at it from a very simplistic kind of Occam's razor perspective, goals, tactics, and strategies of what I would say, again, is a ruling class. It's not just Democrats, because you have several Republicans that go along with this and help try to pave the way for this. Perversely, what is the goal? Maximize power to the greatest extent possible, so you achieve a permanent majority and you continue to keep rewarding or creating the appearance of rewarding your constituents, so you have that power in perpetuity. What are your tactics? Anything and everything, as we've seen with President Biden, for example, with the eviction memorandum. Basically, the courts won't allow it, but it's the right thing to do. It's an emergency, and that's perfectly good and well. And I'm not an authoritarian or a fascist for saying so. What is the strategy? Put out a maximum extreme piece of legislation to, at minimum, shift the Overton window of acceptability, and you keep going down that long march road that Josh is talking about. What is the analog on the Republican side? I mean, conservatives may be able to put forth an analog, but on the Republican Party writ large, there is no analog. It's just a slower move leftward over the long term, however you want to define leftward, or towards concentrated ruling class power effectively. So this all comes down to the stakes, in my view, and at a high level, the dictum that should govern everything should always be, when we're thinking about, at least on the tactics and strategy side, what would Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer do were they in an equivalent situation? And until our purported elected representatives act accordingly, we are always going to lose. We are going to lose perpetually. And that's why it's sort of amazing when there ever is a conservative victory, when you think about it, given how much of the Republican Party serves as the controlled opposition.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's not much else to say about it other than I think Emily is absolutely right. Like, it's a difficult conversation for Republicans to have. In many cases, they put themselves in this box. And I think how they get through this debate is going to be very instructive for if our talking points even still resonate with the base, and how they need to change for them to move going forward. So with that, I'll kick it over to Ben.
Yeah, so I'll go back to my controlled opposition. And one of the topics we address almost every week is how our ruling class kowtows to China and oftentimes seeks to emulate China. And we saw this in maybe one of the most, I won't say brazen, but just overt efforts of the business community, which has been captured by communist China, really even going back to the open of the relationship in the Nixon years. Of course, there was at the time, the Cold War strategic imperative to split, to effectuate the Sino-Soviet split. And there was talk of the fact that over time, China might liberalize, but really there was always a business interest in potentially being able to exploit this massive marketplace. And one quote I think has stuck in my mind from the time I first saw it, that sort of characterizes America's business community, which of course has implications for every community that the business community touches, including, of course, our political class. And that quote is this: Wang Zhen, and this is at the time of Tiananmen Square, in the deliberations that were going on in the Chinese Communist Party that were subsequently released. This Communist Party elder, who called for crushing the democracy protesters at Tiananmen, said this when the question came up, well, how will the rest of the world in general, and America in particular, respond if we engage in a show of force against these democracy protesters? Here's what he said, direct quote: "Foreign capitalists are out to make money, and they'll never abandon a big market for the world like China." That was a direct quote. And I think that perfectly captured and perfectly understood the vast majority of our business community. And that was on full display over the last week when over 30 business groups, including the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, and many other prominent representatives for the restaurant industry, semiconductor industry, agriculture, tech, and beyond, drafted a letter to the Biden administration, generally to the US trade rep in particular, who's taken a relatively harder line on China, at least rhetorically, than many in the administration, and others, calling on the administration to essentially work with full haste to end the tariffs with respect to China and push forward with subsequent phases of trade deals with China aimed at increasing commerce between our two nations, expanding and deepening the economic relationship in terms of trade, investment, and beyond. And they point to the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, in effect, has made strides towards fulfilling its obligations with respect to the phase one trade deal when it comes to allowing US financial firms to do business on the mainland and beyond. set aside the merits of the tariffs for a second. And I've long argued that tariffs shouldn't be thought of as being for their own benefit, but rather a tool of leverage in the economic realm, which is all important for the Chinese Communist Party to achieve its geopolitical aims of supplanting America as the dominant world power. So tariffs shouldn't be thought of just for the benefit of those tariffs, but as the willingness of America to use a tool against China that China might never have expected, given our sort of neoliberalism here. The broader issue here is a business community that is essentially engaging in a Chinese Communist Party influence operation to push our government to remove a stick that's being held against the Chinese Communist Party and to further engage in what ultimately will be a suicidal relationships of the capitalists selling the communists or underwriting the communists with the rope with which to hang us. And that is that economic relations between US and China have been China's key tool of leverage in their march to try to supplant us and become the dominant world power. All of the major business leaders essentially say they ignore it. What matters is profits and greater revenues and a greater bottom line every single year, while we lose the country ultimately, and we lose our geopolitical position with respect to communist China. Now, they frame this, of course, in it'll be better for the American worker to take the tax of a tariff off of them. Inflation can be traced in part, inflation and prices can be traced in part to the tariffs, et cetera. So of course, that speaks to the political imperative for the Biden administration. It gives them cover actually to say, well, we're going to be tough on China, but we're going to remove the tariffs because of the inflationary concerns of the American people going into the midterm elections and beyond. But again, the broader picture is, do American companies put America first, or do they put communist China first? And it's amazing, by the way, that this comes against the backdrop of a trade bulletin that was put out by the USCC, a US-China Economic Commission, which said that essentially Chinese companies have had listed on US exchanges have had $400 billion in market cap wiped out in July 2021 alone as a consequence of the Chinese government's widening crackdown on companies across tech, social media, and education. So let's definitely get further inextricably intertwined with China's economy. That's what the business community is saying. I'm disgusted by this, but I think it shows, again, how far we are from actually competing with communist China, given that this is where our business leaders are, who, of course, have disproportionate political influence. And with that, I turn it over to the group for your take on this kind of sickening letter, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know like where to begin, right? I mean, this is kind of like the logical conclusion, obviously, in retrospect of kind of the whole Nixon goes to China, like reopening of American foreign policy, diplomatic and economic relations with the Chinese Communist Party back in the early 1970s. I mean, at the time, look, I think a lot of like well-intentioned, good-hearted people, believed in kind of like, the economic liberalization will lead to political liberalization and kumbaya, transnationalism, globalism, John Lennon imagined, like whatever, like all that stuff, right? I think a lot of like well-intentioned people thought that this would happen. But like the extent to which big business is like fairly just like unapologetic, I think would be a polite way of putting it. But just completely obstinate and stubborn and adamant about the fact that their profits must be sought after at the expense of all of the horrible things that the Chinese Communist Party does. And none of this will be like news to the viewers, obviously, but China obviously, for decades has had these draconian policies with respect to forced sterilizations, forced abortions. They are obviously now committing genocide in Xinjiang province against the Uyghur Muslim population there. Democratic, Republican administrations alike have now said that is happening. We've talked about what's happening in Hong Kong on previous episodes. China, it frankly looks like a de facto invasion of Taiwan is really not that far out of reach at this point. This is our geopolitical enemy, period. Like no ifs, ands, or buts. This is it. Okay. Like, I mean, like we are not in, thank God we are not in kind of a truly kind of, 1962 kind of Cuban Missile Crisis style Cold War footing against China, like we were with the Soviets back then, but we could get there sooner rather than later. And I guess the question that like I come to, like when I hear Ben's kind of excellent monologue there is, if we get to that point, if we do get to a true kind of Soviet style Cold War setting, which again, I pray to God will never happen, whose side is big business and the Fortune 500 and the woke capitalists? Whose side are they going to choose? Right? The same way like Bernie Sanders chose the Soviets in the 80s, who will like, BlackRock and all these kind of like woke ESG investor types 15 years from now in that hypothetical scenario would choose? I don't know. And the fact that I can't answer that question definitively is immensely troubling, obviously.
I think I've said this before, but like, there is nothing that is currently changing the incentive structure for these businesses, right? They want access to one of the biggest markets in the world. They're clearly not afraid of the Chinese at all. And we have a president who refuses to call China out for being our biggest geopolitical enemy, right? When he was asked about it in the campaign, he's like, whatever, they're just like a competitor, it's fine. No, like this is our biggest, geostrategic problem in America that we're facing is China on so many levels. And I think until we have policymakers that actually recognize that it's not just about trying to out-research them in AI, because it is that, but it's also a lot more. It's about the entire structure of our economy being deferential to China. And there's still huge segments of the right that are okay with that. There are still huge segments of the right that think it is good that, what is happening right now. And of course, you can argue about what a balanced approach would be here. But at the end of the day, until you actually have a policy posture that incentivizes companies away from China and toward the United States, it is my belief that anyway, that we will see more of this. And I think this has to be the next threshold for, a question for our policymakers. It's not just what do you think of China? It's what do you plan to do to make sure our economy can survive in the face of this Chinese threat?
Well, and here's the big picture thing that gets lost in all of these conversations. China's intentionally, first of all, the way that China's economy is organized means the government uses these companies to benefit itself, right? So China uses its economy to benefit its power on the world stage. Now, that's not different or new or anything, but it does mean that if you are contributing and you are working in the Chinese marketplace and working really hard, you're making more money for a government that is seeking to undercut our country and our freedoms, right? By elevating itself as a world power. It is becoming fundamentally unpatriotic. And I know it's how we've done things post all of these trade deals in the aughts, in the 90s. I get it. This is normal, but it should quickly become abnormal because it is unpatriotic. It is a way to undermine the United States. The more successful China's economy is, the more successful it believes it will be as a world power. And so I completely understand the argument that trade with China, cultural exchange, there's a lot of interest in American products in China, right? Chinese people love American movies. That's great. To some extent, yeah, I get it. The blue jeans in, the Eastern Bloc argument, I understand it. But that's not happening right now. We're not seeing that happen on a powerful level. And what we're doing instead is directly contributing to China's rise. And China's rise is directly aimed at toppling the United States from the top of the powers. And if you believe in America, you should believe that we should be atop. And this is not a neoconservative argument. I'm just saying that this is a country that we believe is exceptional. And it is good that we are a leader on the world stage. It is good that we are the leader on the world stage because we are genuinely a beacon for freedom. That is why people flock here en masse. I mean, that's obvious. And China wants to change that. They want to replace us with them. And if you're contributing to their economy, you are engaged in something that at this point is unpatriotic. So I think our norms basically just need to shift on that question.
Yeah, it's worth noting. I didn't even really get to hit the point of the hypocrisy of woke capital here, of course, doing business with aiding, abetting, and enabling, in effect, the world's most powerful, regressive regime that there is. And the other question, that very fundamental question that's never really asked of businesses is, after the last 18 months of China's behavior on the world stage, why in God's name would you ever want to do more trade and business with business entities that are, of course, at the end of the day, responsible to their sole shareholder, at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party? How in God's name could you possibly make the case to the American people that your response to China's malevolence at every single level, just in the last couple of years, and of course it goes back decades, but just in the last couple of years, would ever merit wanting to get further into business with them? It's absolutely absurd. It's totally asinine, and beyond unpatriotic. It's suicidal as a nation to put these interests above the national interest.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Obviously, at the end of the day, look, one of our favorite talking points on this show is knowing what time it is. I think the four of us know what time it is. Big business seems to know what time it is vis-a-vis their bank accounts and their bottom line. I'm not sure they know what time it is vis-a-vis the country imploding and our geopolitical arch foe getting stronger by the day. But in any event, let's transition to parting thoughts here. I'll actually kick us off. So during the show, while we're taping the show on Tuesday, within the first 10 minutes of recording, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo actually resigned. So we didn't get a chance to talk about it on one of the segments here, but maybe we could have multiple parting thoughts on this. It's probably a big enough topic where a lot of us should kind of chime in on this. I feel a little silly actually, because right before we recorded, I did a TV hit about Cuomo, and I predicted that he would not resign, and then of course he went ahead and resigned. But there's a lot to say here. Obviously, I guess what I think about this is, it's crazy that he didn't have to resign after the grandma slaying scandal with respect to the nursing homes. Okay, I mean, the fact that he lasted this long, I think, is atrocious. The fact that, and I am not saying that this sexual harassment report obviously is no big deal. It is a big deal, but it's just a curious kind of balancing of moral priorities to me that. Was it 11, 12, 13 women harassed, each of whom is a horrible story, of course, in its own right. But it was like thousands of elderly people in the nursing homes that were killed. I mean, like, we as a society, it's just like a weird balancing that like this was kind of the death knell and not. I guess it's kind of a good takedown ultimately for the Me Too movement. So I guess we'll certainly see some kind of hot takes roll in about that. But I'm recording this now from New York State. The erstwhile known Tappan Zee Bridge that is now known as the Mario Cuomo Bridge, because Andrew Cuomo actually kind of spent $5 to $7 million of New York State taxpayer money renaming this bridge after his late father. Is probably a mile to mile and a half right behind me. So good riddance. Frankly, just a terrible person. The political scene will be a lot healthier. This state will be a lot healthier with him gone. And I'm happy to defer if anyone else has thoughts on that or anything else.
Well, just remember, the experts who are telling you that Tucker is evil and a bigot for talking to Orban are the same experts that told you Cuomo was a hero for months. People are like, our ruling class, if we call it that, is so completely morally bankrupt, and they are also so completely powerful right now. There's like this wild disconnect between power and people, and that sort of sounds like some like silly Bernie Sanders slogan. It's absolutely true that the ruling class has gotten more secular, more corrupt, and more hypocritical, and more incoherent, all of those different things, as they have also become more and more and more powerful. And just like Mark Zuckerberg trying to control our religious lives under his platform, which actually wants to control speech, like just like him trying to suck more and more of our lives onto his business, the media wants to suck more and more of the power to these corporate outlets that are going to tell you Andrew Cuomo is great. And then just don't look at any of this other stuff. It just speaks to the abject level of corruption among our sanctimonious elites right now, who are taking us down an incredibly dangerous path while they get rich, harass women, and do terrible things to this country.
Well, if you want an even more deeply cynical take, I've got you covered here, which is that if Trump was still in office, Cuomo would be fine right now. Like, this is being allowed to happen because Cuomo is no longer useful. And I hate to put it in those terms, but when you look to the point that Josh made, when you look at what Andrew Cuomo was responsible for during COVID, mass deaths in nursing homes, prioritizing his own family, for vaccine and testing access, fudging the numbers on deaths during COVID. Any one of those things by itself should have taken down a governor, immediately, but it didn't, because the media needed a foil for Donald Trump. The media needed someone to lionize, in the face of whatever they were saying was Trump's mishandling of the virus. But now, okay, well, he's no longer useful to us, so we'll let him topple. And Matt Taibbi had a really good Substack about this recently too, where he talked about like how scandals are now play out in sort of the digital universe, where you reach a threshold on Twitter and suddenly it tips. And that's when you go over, when the chattering class now, reaches a threshold, decides to throw you out. That is now the arbiter of how we deal with our politicians in the scandal, which I think is appalling, but it's the world we live in. So yes, I agree with both Emily and Josh. The fact that it took this long is just an indictment on so many levels, on so many layers of what is wrong, I think, right now in our government and our media and everything else.
I think 100% the cynical take is the right one, and it's probably even more cynical than we could comprehend. But I agree. Cuomo served his purpose. Now he gets hoisted on his own petard. We'll see if that's a lesson on the progressives' own petard. We'll see if that's a lesson to others to follow him, but I doubt it will be, because one leader is more ambitious than the next in our ruling class. I do wonder also, did he potentially fall on the sword here to avoid potentially an even worse fate when it comes to not just culpability for the mass nursing home deaths in his state, but then also the book cooking associated with it? Remember,
Also
the DOJ was looking into it and they sort of dropped it, it seems. But what other potential litigation might he face associated with that? And will that now be dropped because he's already, again, served his political purpose and now paid for his real or perceived sins, of which there are numerous ones beyond just the Me Too aspect of this as well? So I think this is sort of a perfectly captures a tragic tale or tragedy for the ruling class. But of course, Americans have to face the real tragedy of the consequences of these abuses of power and also the disastrous ends of the progressive policies. And I do wonder now also, who will the foil be to Governor DeSantis now? Recently, we've seen, of course, that it's Joe Biden essentially sniping with Governor DeSantis. But now that Cuomo is gone, who will play the foil? And of course, you have a number of blue state governors you could choose from who did equally disastrous things associated with the coronavirus. So I don't know if it's Gretchen Whitmer that's up or Governor Murphy in New Jersey, but what a cast of characters they have.
Yeah, no, well said, everyone. I guess the final thing I will say on this is that it'll be interesting now to see what, if anything, happens to Chris Cuomo, who, of course, obviously is a CNN primetime viewer. And, you know, our friend Mike Davis has called for Chris Cuomo to be canceled, as is Mike Swan's, but we'll see if CNN listens. But perhaps we'll talk about that next week. For now, we are way out of time. So on behalf of Ben, Emily, and Rachel, I'm Josh Hammer, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.